Welcome, everyone. My name is Mindy Kurzer, and I am chair of the planning committee of the annual conference on Native American nutrition. And as you all know, because of the pandemic, we had to postpone our fifth conference, which should have taken place in September, this past September. We will be having a fifth conference sometime. We have to figure out when the safest time is going to be to have it next fall or possibly the following spring. We will be having it. But in the meantime, we decided that for the 2020-21 year, we're going to be hosting a series of webinars. The first one was a screening of the film Gather, which many of you tuned into. And today we are delighted to host our second webinar, which is Chef Nephi Craig, who will be doing a demonstration and talk, and it is entitled Indigenous Foodways Adapting to Change. And Chef Nephi Craig he has 22 years of culinary experience in America and around the world, in London, Germany, Brazil, and Japan. He's an enrolled member of the White Mountain Apache tribe and is also Navajo. Chef Craig is the founder of the Native American Culinary Association, an organization that is dedicated to the research, refinement, and development of Native American cuisine. He recently served as executive chef of the Sunrise Park Resort Hotel. During his 9-year tenure there, Craig and his White Mountain Indigenous Foods culinary team, his White Mountain culinary team, they achieved many national and international benchmarks in establishing a culture of Indigenous foods across North America. He's currently the Nutritional Recovery Program Coordinator and Executive Chef at the Rainbow Treatment Center and Cafe Goju on the White Mountain Apache tribe in Arizona. I'm now going to turn this over to Chef Craig. You may remember him also because he was he was one of the folks featured in the film Gather, so you may already be familiar with him and his work. So now I'm going to turn it over to you. Welcome, Nephi Craig. We're so delighted and honored to have you here today.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules and your daily lives in this this important webinar, and for supporting the organizers, and also for those of you that have seen the film Gather. Thank you for supporting the film. As we move throughout the course of our workshop or presentation today, we'll touch on that more and discuss concepts. But like Mindy had mentioned, I've been cooking 22 years professionally. I'm from the White Mountain Apache tribe. I'm broadcasting to you from the White Mountains in Arizona, northeastern Arizona. I'm about 3.5 hours northeast of Phoenix. And I also grew up on the Navajo Nation as well. Native foods and cooking is something that has really changed my life. And it's an honor for me to be here with you all to share some of that journey. And I hope that what I can help achieve today is maybe shift a perspective on how you might see food and indigenous foods, and also just how you see the practice of cooking. The title of my session today is Indigenous Foods and Adapting to Change. As we are amid a worldwide pandemic, more attention is being given to public health, epidemiology, sanitation, hygiene, a whole host of concepts that we as cooks have kind of been conscious of for a long time. We work very hard to make sure that our food is safe and it's handled properly. We take pride in cleaning our kitchens and being organized. And so I'm here today to offer a perspective on how us as a community of Native and non-Native peoples can begin to utilize our existing knowledge that we have, and also to begin to see food as another layer of how we're going to adapt to the changes post-pandemic. Because this pandemic has brought on, has highlighted so many issues around social justice, inequalities, access to food, access to healthcare. Many injustices have risen to the surface as hot topics in the United States and globally. We feel like right now is a very opportune time to begin to zero in on native food, public health, and the practice, not only just in a professional environment of cooking, but also in the very intimate home environment where we are taking care of ourselves and the people that we love. So I'm going to share a presentation that kind of hopefully will contextualize themes of health, themes of Indigenous foodways, and how we are in this era or generation of reclamation based on action-oriented concepts and behaviors, all centered around food. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to start off with this this slideshow that gives you some info, and then I'll jump right into doing a demonstration. I'll be demonstrating a dish with some winter squash, some winter corn. Some winter squash and some winter greens, and beans and squash. And we'll discuss and talk a little bit more about the importance of those ingredients. So I'm going to start this screen share and start to run you through this. Oh, excuse me. What I have here, if you can't see the full screen, you can minimize the little window and just put it on speaker view. And this is the presentation. So as it relates to native health and health disparities across North America and even South America and into Canada, there's always a big conversation about how and why do these health disparities exist? Why can a calorie-rich landscape like my ancestral territory in northeastern Arizona still be considered a food desert? Why is it that lush environments, or why different reservations or pockets of indigeneity across the United States and other parts of Turtle Island be considered food deserts? Why is there high rates of mortality, suicidality, and diabetes and other health disparities? It's much beyond the behavioral aspect of having access to food. It also comes down to the psychology of Indigenous food and eating. So I just subtitled this the Psychology of Indigenous Food and Eating series, because I hope that this is just one doorway into another way to see your practice that you might already do now, whether it's cooking at home or whether it's professionally or academically. I hope you can absorb this information as coming from a point as a native chef this is lived experience. And this is kind of a result of people asking me, why aren't there Native American restaurants in my community? How come I've never seen a Native restaurant? Why are there is there such thing as a Native American cuisine? So the root cause of a lot of these questions and issues is much deeper. So this is what that presentation kind of goes into. And I consider this action with food something I call in restorative Indigenous food practices, because we are a part of an era that is restoring balance through our foodways. So this is a place-based social science technique that integrates a lot of developments from a lot of disciplines. As you can see, from nutrition to psychology to social work, industrial psychology and organizational development, Indigenous principles of leadership and recovery principles. Because as you know, food enables us to live and thrive. Healthy food choices enable us to have optimum brain function. So restorative Indigenous food practices is at the core of all of our behaviors, and even in the fast-paced world we live in, or if we're in a slower-paced world. So this utilizes place-based Indigenous food and agricultural methodology as an axis for therapeutic learning, teaching, and healthy communication while revitalizing culture and wellness. Ultimately, all this boils down to is restoring and mending relationships, not just with people, but with time, identity, landscape, and ourselves, most importantly. So as we're understanding why our food choices are the way they are in just general American society, and also as Indigenous communities and Indigenous people and families, we have to understand our culinary history. And to really kind of put this into a nutshell, there's an era of pre-colonization where we as Indigenous people were thriving civilizations. Indigenous agriculture is thousands and thousands and thousands of years old, so much that native peoples have domesticated cultivars like you see here: corn, beans, squash, tomatoes, chilies, cocoa, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The domestication of corn, beans, and squash and indigenous cultivars has revolutionized the entire world. And that's just one example of indigenous contributions to the world. And this technology, this ancestral knowledge and this traditional ecological knowledge, this technology was supported and enabled by really complex trade routes across Native America. And so this pre-colonization point is really important because it enables us to remember or reconnect with the ancestral intelligence that's woven into the fabric of our DNA. And we can begin to talk about concepts like ancestral health, ancestral knowledge, and even ancestral justice. So the era of pre-colonization is very important. And remember, we can't just love ourselves in that frame. We've got to love ourselves right now in preparation for the future. So there's a notion that we can just always talk in the past tense about us as indigenous people as it relates to our contemporary experience. That is actually damaging to ourselves and our self-perception when we say we used to be this, or we should be this, or we could have been that. In reality, the language that we choose in referring to our past in the pre-colonization era, when we say we still are thriving civilizations, we still practice indigenous agriculture, we still are reclaiming this gastronomic food history around these cultivars and wild foods and hunting and fishing, that is an empowering choice of words. So that first phase of pre-colonization is important to acknowledge and look at. And we have to also understand that trauma is a very important part of our story. So historical culinary trauma is very important. The era of conquest and colonization, the era of the Indian Wars, or quote unquote Indian Wars, phenomenon and occurrences in America like the bison extermination campaigns, the ethnogenocide of people, land, and waters. And there are many, many more elements to the violent appropriation of North America and the United States, and even South America, Canada, and Alaska. This is a part of our trauma narrative. And as practitioners, community members, parents, professionals, we cannot stay stuck in this era. It's just like healing from any type of emotional, psychological piece that might ail us. We have to understand the hurt before we can move on. It's only through the pain that we can carry the pain. So this era was carried out politically, militaristically. It was socially acceptable, publicly enforced. It was a legal process to make this all happen. So naturally, in order to undo and begin to work through our trauma narrative collectively as indigenous peoples and as non-native peoples, these type of conversations need to happen. And we have to be able to understand where the sources of our power come from, because more than likely, a lot of that resilience and strength and determination is rooted in a lot of these adverse experiences. And when we can shift the paradigm around that, we can really move forward with a much more solution-based, protective factor-oriented approach to any of our work. And food is just at the kind of the catalyst, the nucleus of all this. So now our era of what I've labeled here as Indigenous Resurgence, or this Indigenous reclamation, or some people call it a native food movement. Whatever label you're putting on this phenomenon that is circling around foodways, it is important. It is an energy force. It is propelling practitioners like myself forward and many, many others. And remember that this is a micro-regional phenomenon. This is a micro-regional anthropological occurrence in every single pocket of Native communities across America, whether it's in a metropolitan area or on a reservation like mine. So in this era right now, We are healing from historical trauma. We are engaged in this form of social recovery. We are now more than ever articulating the Indigenous experience to develop and strategize decolonization strategies. How can we truly intelligently coexist moving forward into the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 generations of our lives? Many native farmers, hunters, fishers, medical professionals, community members, we have always seen ourselves as land advocates. So what is the land saying to us now? And how do we communicate that, that message that we get from our Mother Earth and our local environment? Now more than ever, so many more Indigenous foodway models exist. Even this platform that we're communicating on, this is a form of digital trade. This is Indigenous trade routes through technology. And so 20 years ago, opportunities like this to share an Indigenous perspective in a way that really approaches our true culinary and historical narrative, maybe not were as common or maybe not even as possible. I certainly remember that period around when I started cooking professionally in 1998. It was very difficult to find any type of Indigenous foodway models. And very rarely did you hear Indigenous food sovereignty being used by young people in communities. So with more Indigenous research, more Indigenous professionals, and more ethical practice, we're going to continue this era of change. And so you are a part of that just by watching it. So thank you for coming. And in doing this, we challenge the false narrative or the master narrative that was written about us, not by us. So even me articulating my experience through food, recovery, professionalism, and just life, this is how we are challenging what is all the misconceptions that are placed on us. And what I really hope that this can promote among us as individuals is a culinary cultural paradigm shift, because that is really needed, because food choices and food preferences and cravings, they are very intimate. They are woven into the fabric of our bio, psychology, and all of our experiences in life inform food choices and food behaviors. So if we can begin to change our perspective and thinking around food, we can begin to shift the momentum in a way that is a little bit more broad and colorful and amazing and nutritious. So with that said, this is just my definition of what Native American cuisine is. I wrote Cultural Intuition guides us to develop Indigenous cuisine in an Indigenous way. Therefore, Indigenous cuisine will not be fine dining focused, but rather driven by our ancestral vision and the priority of healing Indigenous communities. This is the scholarly, scientific, therapeutic, and spiritual nature of Native foods in our generation and since time immemorial. This mode is really nothing new. We're looking back to move forward. We're looking back to stay grounded right now in the present. So whatever medium or art form that you might love to do as a profession or a hobby, by following your passions, you have this opportunity to participate in the same way. For Native foods, I don't think as a chef, like I said, it's not necessarily fine dining focused. I think it's the voice inside the cultivars and the culinary history. They're saying, do something different, do something more closely connected to the health of people. And so this is kind of what I hopefully would like to see continue in the future. So, and our Indigenous culinary future, here are some images that I've shared, that I want to share. This is so important for our posterity, that we activate ancestral knowledge, or we activate traditional ecological knowledge. In this picture here, you're seeing a group of young Apache people, young Apache kids in Sibique, Arizona, with an elder that's cutting up a roasted agave stalk, or in Apache language, we call it ikuz. And that is the stalk of the century plant that we simply just throw in the coals and let it roast. And that turns nice and sweet. It's a natural sugar that is more beneficial to our bodies than white processed sugar or many other forms of sugar. We've been eating this as Apache people and natives in the American Southwest for millennia. And if these kids have never tasted the acuz in this picture, there is no neurological pathway in their brain to hold that data. And look how intently those kids are looking at the ingredient. Elder Andrea Beatty here, she's not using a fancy cutting board. She's just got her station set up. But those kids are so intently focused on what she is doing. And when they taste this for the first time, there's a lightning storm inside of our brain or their brain that occurs that forms a neurological pathway. And that will never, ever, ever go away. That kind of shows the power of food and food memories that we all have and share around cooking and food. So when we can create the opportunity to be conduits or facilitators of the voice inside food, we can really create life-changing memories that are small moments, but in the larger history of our own lives, it's very, very impactful. So activating ancestral knowledge. This work, I chose to put this picture in here because most of our work that we attempt to do and like to do is community-based on the White Mountain Apache tribe and other native communities. But I put this picture in here because, as you can see, all the beautiful brown faces, right? All Apache people, you see young people, elders, you see a whole mix there. And they're all intently looking at the food again. And so I also put this picture in here is because this is not just only a demonstration about food and the deliciousness. This is a demonstration of action by me and the two chefs that are helping me there, Randall Kosen and Juwan Hendricks, that this is possible. Professional cooking is possible in our community. Those little kids that are watching, they say, wow, that looks cool. Maybe I can do that someday. And then maybe grandma in the background is saying, wow, this is so awesome. This is really neat. We need more of this. So just the demonstration of community-based work or even outreach like this is important. And what I really hope to see more as moving forward is more academic articulation by Indigenous scholars and professionals. We need that community-based element, but we also need, it's like that sentiment where around the boarding school era, when parents would send their kids to boarding schools or they would get taken to boarding schools or they allowed their children to go, is that you're gonna learn their language so that we can use that to protect ourselves. So we still need to integrate contemporary science and practices and modalities, but with an Indigenous spirit or an Indigenous core. And so academia and professionalism is an important part of this equation as we shift our paradigm around food, because sometimes the words don't exist that to articulate our Indigenous experience. So when we have Indigenous based or Indigenous professionals or scholars that emerge into professionals, we can develop the terminology to weave into our healing modalities. And that's why this slide is in here and is very important. Here's just an image as a little reminder. If this work is inaccessible to the poor, it's neither radical nor revolutionary. We need to be able to address food access and access to care. This is also why in my definition of native cuisine is that it's not fine dining focused or it's not fine dining based. What I feel as a native chef with my years of experience is that I believe that what is more important as it comes to Native American cuisine is what is my entire community cooking? What does my entire community love in terms of food choices and access to food? That is really representation of what cuisine is. So if we're gonna develop these modalities or recipes or approaches, it has to be with all those, the core demographics that are in need, that they're kept in mind. And this is a fun one. It has to be transformational. You see that? This meme here that I created is see the little raccoon on the left. That's how you come into our native kitchen. You enter kind of poor, it's cold outside, you're hungry and curious, and then you enter and you get some training and you work and you learn new skills, you learn a new vocabulary, you understand indigeneity, you get introduced to ethics, and you really you activate ancestral knowledge, and you are able to flip a paradigm. You are able, this is how you hopefully will leave, right? Ready to take on the ills of colonialism and be an action-oriented practitioner or compatriot in the field of native foods. So I just like to share that. The native food work that we do, it must be relevant and tangible. This image here was developed because we were hoping to reach a younger demographic in terms of professional cooking, to make it cool, make it accessible, because it is cool and it is accessible. It's just that we might perceive that it's not. And so when I searched on the internet trying to find an image of native chefs or a cartoon that would make it look cool, all I could find was big round chefs holding wine bottles and big tall skinny waiters as caricatures with towels over their arms. So the message or theme with this graphic is that if the medium or the art form or the language or the imagery doesn't exist to communicate the message of indigeneity, you have every right to create it as a native person. And that's what we did here. And this one, as you see, says life skills are knife skills, or knife skills or life skills, I'm sorry. A part of this food paradigm and moving forward and adapting to change is carrying this knowledge and experience with us and understanding the generational impacts of historical culinary trauma and breaking free of dependency. Because remember that dependency was implanted like a microchip in native communities. And that was a strategic act. And you see here military food rations being distributed at Pine Ridge in 1891. And this is an era where it was very, very violent and very scary for our ancestors and elders to go out and hunt and do certain things. So we were made to depend on government rations at a military prison camp that ultimately evolved into the commodity food program. So this undoing of that experience needs to happen over time. So on part of our culinary narrative or trauma narrative is the boarding school era. So we've even taken a look at some of the foodways and practices that were imposed on a younger generation of children that were the children of prisoners of war in the early 1800s or early 1900s. So it's really important, and as you think about the experience of young people, consider looking up the Adverse Childhood Experience study. I think it's a Kaiser Permanente study, or just look up ACEs, and you can kind of get an understanding of some of the predictors of traumatic experiences in young people. That's kind of a predictor for health disparities and later on in life. So this is a big part of our food history as well. Whatever it is that you do, whether you're in a metropolitan area or you're on your ancestral territory, or you're striving to be reconnected to land, this work should always be place-based and hoping to activate ancestral knowledge. This image here is an example of Western Apacheria before the establishment of reservations. As you can see, the little map of Arizona on the bottom. Much of Western Apacheria encompasses, a big part of the state, from up into Flagstaff, down into the desert near Tucson, and much of the mountains. So we became White Mountain Apaches by interacting with our landscape. It was the foods, it was the plants, it was the animals, it was the waters, it was the seasons that informed our identity. So this is why the land back movement, or promoting and getting more indigenous people access to ancestral territories, is critical in the next phase or generations of us healing and recovering. Because remember, the census anticipates that in the American Southwest by 2030, people of color or BIPOC people are going to be the majority. And then by 2050 in the United States of America, minorities will be the majority. So now we are at a point where we have the opportunity to do some vision casting and begin to adapt to those changes, because most of the modalities for healing and law and land access and resources, those all come from a colonial paradigm, a Western paradigm of power and structure. But as the population changes and more indigenous people begin to populate, there's going to be a greater need for indigenous-based programming to happen. So think of it as you adapt to change, because as you can see, we are not the minority. There are millions of native peoples from Argentina all the way up to Alaska. And in this image, you see all these beautiful brown indigenous faces, and each of these regions are experiencing what I'm articulating and more. Each of these regions is a complex pocket of indigeneity that is going through this phenomenon of resurgence and reclamation and using foodways and land to get back to their health. So keep that in mind. And as you go about this, when you're recollecting food memories, when you're doing oral storytelling, or when you're harvesting traditional foods, or when you're planting seeds, or when you're singing to your crops, or you're singing to your corn, and you have someone there that you're teaching, remember that that's a sacred transfer of ancestral knowledge. That's a sacred transfer of traditional ecological knowledge. In this graphic here, there's a little granddaughter and grandma. There's those two living things, two living beings there, but there's one more that's living, and that's the knowledge that's being passed on between grandma and granddaughter. That knowledge is alive. That knowledge will thrive, and it's up to us to give it life. So carrying on food traditions is very much that. So it's really neat. This term is much like the cartoon that we created. When the word doesn't exist to articulate your experience, create it. And this is one of those terms, ancestral justice. So basically, to me, this is a living action verb. It's a term used by us to engage that indigenous resurgence through restorative food practices, to articulate genetic dignity, resiliency transmitted through living human fractals. Consider that you are a living human fractal. If you a fractal is a mathematical equation that when it's drawn out, it's a repeating pattern that goes on forever. And so a fractal, we are fractals of our ancestors. And so as you articulate that, there are genetic messages of dignity and resiliency woven into the fabric of your entire being. So ancestral justice is directly connected to ancestral memory and the restoration of balance in indigenous lifeways. An example would be living a life of integrity while activating ancestral knowledge in life on the red road. So for me, that's living a life in sobriety and continuing to try to communicate a message like this. And many, many other people experience that in different ways. So as you can see, our food choices and our health disparities are much more deep than just access to land. They're much more deep and personal than just the cooking skills we possess in our hands and in our minds. It's a psychological and spiritual reality that, while connecting to time and place, look at it this way before I start cooking, is that, look at it this way before I start cooking, is that right now, indigenous food knowledge, I just barely scratched the surface. And much of the indigenous food knowledge that benefits our mental health and our spirituality, that knowledge, if ancestral knowledge is alive and floating around in the universe around us, right now that knowledge is kind of existing in a diaspora. It's kind of existing, it's floating and waiting for us as Native peoples to reach out and grab that and empower ourselves. So that's why food vocabulary and expanding our food paradigm as it relates to culinary history for Native peoples, and also our contemporary reality. And as we plan for the future, that's why it's so important. So that's the presentation I wanted to share. And what I'm going to do next, I'm going to demonstrate. Here, as you can see, here's my knife board with the chef that we created. So I'm going to demonstrate a dish with winter squash. And I'm also going to demonstrate using some winter greens. So I'm going to do a winter squash with a butternut squash. And I'll just get right to work and jump right in it. And then at the end, you can ask a few questions. And I'm offering this dish to you as a maybe an addition to your holiday meal planning that's coming up. You got a couple holidays coming, maybe like 4 major meals: Christmas Eve, Christmas Day, New Year's Eve, New Year's Day, right? And then plus we're all at home, quarantined and practicing social distancing, so we have more time for cooking, I hope. So consider adding this to one of your dishes, and it starts with butternut squash. So 2 ways that I like to do this. You can either, I'll just show you real quick. You can take a simple peeler and you can peel the squash like that. And you don't necessarily need to peel it. Sometimes the squash, and most of the time the squash is edible. I mean, the skin is edible, but just for the purpose of demonstration, I'll show you that it's pretty easy to peel with a peeler. The skin is not as tough as, like, say, a pumpkin or a kobacha squash, and it will soften up. So that's one option that you can do to peel it. And a butternut squash, here's the neck, it's solid, and the cavity, or right here where the seeds are, is hollow. So I'm going to split it vertically just for purposes of the demonstration. And remember that all squash are indigenous cultivars. And if you ever wondered why cavity squash is considered so nutritious, in my opinion, it's because it's carrying all these little babies in here, all these seeds to carry on life. So it's carrying so much power in nutrition and carrying these little seeds. This is a mama right here. And so that's why it's so nutritious. So adding stories like that to the food, give it more intimate connection and makes it a little more fond to work with. So I'll just take my seeds and I'll scoop them out. And as I'm talking, my saute pan is heating up. And this is going to be a kind of like a roasted winter squash dish. I'm just going to take out all my seeds and I'll save these for later. So I'm just going to set them off to the side there. Maybe keep this right here in case I need that little piece. So when you're using your knives, remember, if you're going to go on the journey of cooking, investing in quality equipment is important. A sharp knife is a safe knife. Consider what you've invested in your own life. Quality education, quality job training, quality friends. Makes the same sense to invest in quality cooking equipment because it'll last a long time. So I've got a heavy saute pan. It has a metal handle. This is an all-clad brand, but you can hear the density of it, and this conducts heat nice and evenly. It'll help to caramelize, and it'll last me, generations if I wanted to take care of it that long. So just a little tip. So for the purpose of the demo, I'm only going to use the part of the neck. I'm going to save the cavity for another dish later on. And when you're using your knives, you just, I like to square it off, and I'm going to cut it into like a small dice. Can you see my hand, my knife hand and my guide hand? I'm letting my knuckles protect my fingertips. So it's kind of like that. See that? And then I square it off so it's nice and stable. And then I'm just going to cut it into like little thick matchsticks, or in kitchens we call these batons. So I'm going to cut them and just dice them up. And I'm not going to be too fussy about making them all exactly square. I just want them to be roughly the same size so they cook evenly. Again, this is all for cooking at home. And the main part of the process, where most of the flavor comes from, I'll talk about right here just a second when I get these cut up. So practicing your knife skills is a life skill, like this board says, because you can pass this on. In all of our teaching and classes, we say that learning to use a knife is like riding a bike. and we can pass on this tradition to help our younger children take care of themselves later on in life. And this never goes away. So my pan is nice and hot. I'm just going to take a little bit of oil here. Just going to get it in the saute pan. And the pan is nice and hot. I don't want it too smoking hot, but I would definitely want it hot enough so that it sizzles. And so I'm going to get it in the pan, and I'm just going to I'm not going to stir it around too much. I'm going to let the caramelization happen. And this is where understanding the basics of cooking enables you to produce a lot of flavor. The secret, the secret about professional chefs around the world is that the best professional chefs in the world, they do the basics every day, all the time. It's like endurance training where you're practicing muscle memory. Well, understanding the culinary fundamentals like a good knife, a quality cookware, and like something like caramelization will help you to build flavors and get more out of the products you choose. So we got squash in here caramelizing, and I've got another indigenous cultivar. I've got some yellow corn here, and I chose to do this dish as an example or a continuation of expanding our food paradigm, because people always say, like, how come there's no native cuisine restaurants, or how come what's a real native dish? I don't even know. I've never even heard of native foods or native cuisines, and they don't even really understand that they've been eating native foods and practicing indigenous cuisine all their lives. When you go into a grocery store, a majority of the products in the store are indigenous foods. So we give this guy a stir. You can see it's starting to get a little bit of color here. So when you walk into the grocery store, you go down the Italian section, right? There's all that pasta, and then you turn around, then there's a whole aisle of tomatoes. Well, all of that is indigenous foods. There were no tomatoes anywhere in Eurasia, and specifically Italy, prior to 1500. The same thing with corn, the same thing with beans, the same thing with squash. I'm going to add in a little bit of chilies, but same thing with chilies. There was no chili anywhere in Europe, Asia, India, Vietnam, Korea, all these regions that are known for spicy, fiery cuisines with chilies. Those cuisines were not like that before 1500. There were spicy spices like peppercorns and mace and cloves, those kind of spices, but no chilies. So the next time you see a shishito, the Japanese pepper, is like, yeah, that's not Japanese, that's indigenous, you know? So just keep that in mind. These food facts can really switch up our paradigm and how we see our cooking and our food choices. So check on my squash here. And I'm just letting it caramelize. And here's one of the fun things about cooking is that this is a science. It's a behavioral science, it's culture, it's nutrition, it's art, it's language, right? If I was a fluent Apache language speaker, I could say all of these ingredients in my indigenous language, but it's the foods that are teaching me now, like this one here has taught me to call it bishkan. This is squash in Apache. There's many things. And here's one way for when you're cooking at home and you want to geek out and start talking about food and cooking. You can say, this is how cooking is a science. I got radiant energy, right? It's going up and it's heating the room. I got fire here. I put a saute pan down, it becomes energy transfer, right? And that energy is transferred into the squash and it's caramelizing it. It's making the Maillard effect happen. It's getting brown, it's developing flavor, and it's pulling out all those natural sugars. That's caramelizing those natural sugars. And so it's a science. And kind of my theory on food and deliciousness is that when you see roasted brown golden colors in food and cooking, the difference between just a raw color is beautiful on its own, the raw orange like this, and then the different color change that happens with caramelization, you see it as delicious. But what my theory is that your body and brain are so intelligent on its own that your body is saying, I want that natural sugar. I want that energy. Your brain is saying that looks delicious, and your personal self is saying, that looks good, right? So that's just my personal theory on caramelization and how we eat with our eyes. So I'm going to test this, see if it's done. I cut them small because this is a quick food demo. And it's almost there. This is kind of an example of pan roasting. Just a tip on cookware. I could pan roast it like this. And the reason why it's important to choose quality equipment that has like metal handles is because you can throw this whole pan, you can throw this whole saute pan in the oven, and it won't, you could roast in here. You could sear a big piece of meat in here and throw it in the oven, just like that. So then my squash is
Nephi, this is Mindy. Can I ask a few people have asked some questions about what you're doing?
Please.
Okay, so one, Michelle asked, what kind of knife do you recommend that's affordable yet easy to cut through fresh squash?
As you can see, I got different types of knives here. There's different types of steel out there, but I usually choose quality ones. This one is a Fujiwara, but Wishthof is a good example of a good quality knife. There's global knives. The cooking has become so a little more popular, so even some of the stores will sell brands, like some of the Faberwares are different, but if are decent. But if you're going to get a knife, I'd say go online and Google chef knives, or global, or Wishthof, or Fujiwara, or Japanese knives too. They're all really good. But I say start, if you're going to begin your knife collection, all you really need is a chef knife and a good paring knife and a steel, a knife steel. So that's kind of the starter kit. Then everything else you add in over time as your obsession gets stronger.
And Nephi,
Yes.
Shelby has asked, at what age do you recommend teaching knife skills to kids?
I think that depends on the kids you're working with, whether they're your kids or it's in an educational. I think kids can, it just depends. They sell these little tiny kid-safe knives that are plastic, but they'll cut through stuff like maybe they'll cut through like soft things, like maybe stalks of they'll cut through like lettuce, or they'll cut through apples, or they'll cut through carrots, but they're somewhat safe. But I say, maybe wait until adolescence until you start actually giving them knives, just for safety, just common sense. A lot of cooking is common sense.
Great, thank you. Two more questions. Jamie
Yes.
asks, do you use cast iron pans much? And could you use one for this dish? And one other question is, Christina asks, what kind of oil are you using?
Okay, yes, you could definitely use cast iron pans. A cast iron pan also releases iron into the food as well, so it's also good for that. What I would say, if you can avoid, is using really acidic foods in a cast iron. So no white wine, minimal tomatoes. If you're gonna do lemon juice only at the end, I wouldn't make a big batch of tomato sauce in a cast iron just because it can oxidize and pick up a weird flavor. That's real subtle. And the oil I'm using is just really light olive oil. There's many oils to choose from. Indigenous oils you could choose, maybe sunflower oil, maybe olive oil, avocado oil. There's hazelnut oil. There's corn oil is definitely indigenous, but I usually like to stick with olive oil just for accessibility and the purposes of education as the first step in expanding. I use all those other oils I talk about, but sometimes for people that are just beginning, we want to start with what's accessible, and that makes it a little bit easier. So hope that answers that. I'm going to demonstrate some winter greens. So wintertime, I got some kale here. This has been washed. I soaked it in water, and I just soaked it in a big bowl of water for about 10 minutes in cold water and let that loosens up any dirt. Then I shake it up and then let all that, any soot or sediment sink to the bottom of the bowl. Then I take it out and then I'll rinse it again and I pat it dry. So that's what I've already done here. And I'm going to show you a really quick way to cook this, this kale. And all I do, a lot of people will braise kale, and that's awesome and great, and it's wonderful and tasty and all of that. But keep in mind, the less you cook something, the closer you can eat it to its raw state, the most nutritious it will be. So for people that want to kind of really cook seasonally, there's a lot of good winter greens right now, and that's why I'm using the winter squash. And that's why I'm kind of doing this winter version of Three Sisters. If this was the summertime, I would be using zucchini in my Three Sisters. I would be using yellow squash. I would be using tomatoes. I would probably use like maybe wild lamb's quarters or wild spinach as the greens in there. So I'm just cooking seasonally with this dish. By the way, I took this off the heat. This is pretty much done. I've got some cooked beans here that I'm just going to warm through because they're already done. I'm going to show you this Three Sisters dish with some wilted chili garlic kale. And so my pan is nice and hot. I've got 1 clove of fresh garlic. Just take your knife and just kind of crush it. And I'm not gonna try to mince this. I'm just gonna give it a rough chop. And again, protecting your fingertips, your guide hand and your knife hand. Take it, and you can see my fingertips are nowhere. I'm not holding it like this. Safety is one of the first principles in cooking. So you just take it and just kind of let your knife cut through it gently like that. In the beginning, you're going to start like this, and that's fine. But over time, you're going to build a muscle memory and you're going to get more proficient. So as you're cooking, don't try to get all technical right away. You start with the basics. So I'm going to take my garlic. I've got some chili flakes. I'm going to do some chili slices as kind of a nice bright garnish at the end. So I got my kale pulled off the stems, and I'm just going to give it a rough chop like that. And then I've got a little bit of water just hanging out right here, and you'll see why. So my pan is nice and hot. I don't want to have it too hot to where it burns the garlic. Garlic and kale are like best friends. They're so good together. Then you add in the chili, it's just like it turns into a party. So I'm going to add this in there, and I just want my garlic to brown a little bit. See that? It's nice and hot. You're kind of infusing the flavor of the garlic into the oil, and you're going to time this and watch it because you don't want it to burn. So it happened pretty quickly. And I just put my greens in there, and I kind of move it around like that, not touching the pan, but get some of that garlic off of the pan itself. And then you can go back and get any other pieces off your cutting board like that. And I don't season at this point because right now it looks like a whole bunch of kale, but it's going to shrink down when I wilt it. So you can give it a stir with a spoon, or you can toss it however you're comfortable. So here's, I haven't added the salt or pepper or the chilies yet. I'm going to take just a touch of water. You're not trying to make it swim in water. You're just going to, this is going to give it some steam to help it. So just like that. See that? Just let it steam, and that'll help it to wilt. You can see it changed color really fast. It activated that chlorophyll. It gets really nice and bright, and you don't really, you can cook it really fast and it's still really delicious. You don't need to braise these winter greens. So I'm just gonna keep it on a high heat until all the water that I put in there, majority of it evaporates. Just let that steam wilt the greens for me, and then I'll season. So you can see the nice, bright, beautiful color here. And so I'm gonna go ahead and take a small pinch of chili flakes. I like the chili. I like this this combination to be nice and garlicky and spicy. So I'm gonna be generous with the chili flakes. I season with kosher salt, just a touch at the top, and a little bit of a cracked black pepper. You don't have to use pepper. You could just totally just leave just the chili flakes as the spicy component. but I like to use pepper. So just gonna take it and give it a toss. And then I'm gonna give it a taste. The most important piece of this is tasting. Yeah, that's really good. I can taste the garlic. It's nice and pungent. I get the heat right away. And the flavor of the kale is, you know, funky and grassy and, you know, greeny, right? So this is done. This is actually done. So you can see how fast that went. I've got my little heat mats and I just put it off to the side. So I put my two sisters back on the stove here, the corn and the squash. Now I'm going to add some cooked beans here. And because the beans are already cooked, I'm just going to warm them through. Let me wipe down my knife and put it up here. I'm just going to warm these through. And we're almost done with the demo. Then we open up for a few more questions here in a minute. So I'm just warming up the beans, going to season it, a little bit of salt, a little bit of pepper. And again, you can see I'm seasoning at the end. I'm going to take this, I'm going to take my chili and I'm just going to cut some little rounds, some kind of on the bias here. And this is going to be to add a little bit more heat and spice at the end of my dish. So I'd like you to consider adding this to your holiday tables or even your regular dinners, because it's healthy, nutritious, and it's purely indigenous. So indigenous cultivars that work. So I'm going to take my kale. I could mix them together. That'll be awesome. But I'm going to put it down just in the bottom of my pan like this, like a little bed. I'll just spread them around. And I'm adding the kale just as for more nourishment, help out my liver a little bit, right? It's a winter green, you know, cooking seasonally is fun and delicious, but you don't necessarily need the green. You could just do the Three Sisters by itself. So that's what I'm going to add on top of here, just like that. And that color, that really nice, vibrant, kind of fall or autumn color really starts to come to life. I'm going to top it off with my chilies. And here's a note on acidity and salt. Salt, as you know, too much of it is bad for you and can cause problems. If you don't want to add too much salt, add a couple drops of lemon juice, because the way that I always teach this is that salt helps to pull out flavor, draw out flavors or enhances flavors. And lemon or acid kind of brightens flavors up or pushes them forward. So instead of adding more salt to this, I'll just add a couple drops of lemon juice. I don't want it to be sour or taste like lemon. I just want it to be nice and bright. And just a really colorful dish, winter ingredients. And to me, the reason that this particular dish or this combination is so important is because the practice of companion planting for corn, beans, and squash is thousands and thousands of years old. The three important cultivars, corn, beans, and squash, working together in the soil, in the microbes, in the growing process, in their relationship with us as humans, and then even down to the nutritional level where they combine and form a protein. This to me is like one of the best entry-level foods to native cooking. This is thousands of years beyond, fry bread or colonization foods that are flour-based, originated from that reservation era when the military rations were issued. So this would change with each season, with each cultivar. Many different types of corn, many different types of squash, many different types of beans, and the seasons that go with it. So do the math. There's probably hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of combinations of indigenous cultivars to form a protein. And so the last thing I'll add to that before we start ask some questions is that you can also teach this to a classroom of kindergarten students in elementary school in a community garden. You could teach this and do a cooking demo for high school kids and adolescents. You could teach the food history and the science of this to college students and nutritionists. You could even do PhD research on trade routes and cultivars and indigenous resurgence through foodways just by following the food. So that's why following the ingredients, they won't lie to you. The scientific evidence of botany and agriculture and how food traveled throughout the Americas, that's the true narrative that gives us the most, not just physical nutrition for our guts, but also the psychological and spiritual nutrition that we're so desperately craving right now. So that's the dish, and I'm open to some questions now.
Nephi, thank you so much. I wish that
Yeah.
we could taste it. We don't have the technology yet, but we want to taste
I'll
it.
taste it for you.
Oh, good. It looks beautiful. Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation and demo. And I can tell you that through the, is it taste good? You're
Yeah, it's
happy with
awesome.
it?
Yeah, I'm happy with it.
I can
want
tell
more
you
chili.
that through the questions online, you're getting a lot of love and respect. So people are really, really enjoying this. We have lots of questions, too many for you to answer, but I'll start out with a few questions that are focused on the cooking itself, and then afterwards on some of your thoughts about food sovereignty and indigenous cuisine and history and all of that. So the first question from Carla is, what kind of chili are you using?
I just got general red pepper flakes, nice and spicy. Then I got some of the red long chilies. So you could use whatever chili you want. This is just what I had available. Usually I like to use serranos because I really like that really hot, clean heat that serranos give me. But this is just what I had in my fridge, so I wanted to use it up.
Great. Another question from Michelle is, how do you get rid of the hard-coated larvae that get stuck on greens?
Can you repeat that? I'm sorry.
How do you get rid of the hard-coated larvae that sometimes get stuck on greens?
I would just say just washing it, or as you're cleaning it, you're paying attention to it. Especially if you're getting it from a local farm, or if you're getting it prepackaged in the grocery store, it's going to maybe be washed. But when you bring it home, during the cleaning and washing your foods is really important. So you can either take a little hand towel and just kind of clean it off if you want to get that meticulous. But soaking it in nice cold water will loosen up any of that stuff, and it'll help come off easier.
Thank you. And Roman asks, with the kale dish, can you use chicken stock or broth instead of water?
Yeah, you could do that, but I make a choice not to use chicken stock. Just because I want to just taste the kale, I just want to taste the greens. It does add more depth, but for me in Indigenous Foodways, like when I pre-cooked the beans, I didn't cook them in chicken stock. I didn't cook them in any beef broth or anything like that. I just cook them in water, and that's just my own personal choice to let the cultivars be who they are and just taste those flavors. But it's up to you. Yes, you totally could.
Thank you. Rachel asks, how do you make sure not to burn the garlic? My garlic always burns when I saute it.
Well, basically you just watch it. You just turn the heat on maybe a medium. And what I like to do that I'll show you real quick is when the pan is hot, I have my garlic all chopped up either in my hand or a little bowl, and tilt the pan so that whatever oil, you can either turn off the heat or turn it down. Let some of the oil pool up in the pan right here, and put your garlic into the oil, and you'll be able to watch it right there. And then you can see whether it's too hot or not. But if you put the oil in the pan before you saute it and it starts to smoke, it's too hot for your garlic. You just want the oil to like shimmer in the pan and not be smoking yet. So you just got to watch it.
Thank you. Louise asks, are there any substitutes for beans for someone who does not eat beans?
You could do garbanzos. I mean, if you're not talking specifically about these type of legumes or these type of beans, or you could just do squash and corn, or you could do lentils, or just it's up to you. But the indigenous cultivars we're focusing on here were corn, beans, and squash.
Okay, and how did you prepare your beans? Can you use canned? And if so, what do you recommend?
I recommend using dried ones. You could soak them overnight. You could do a quick soak, put them in a pot of water, bring them up to a boil and turn it off and let them sit for about 20 minutes and then turn the heat back on and simmer them. But I always try to do dried beans. These are Anasazi beans, and I cooked kidney beans. But in the native food repertoire, there are hundreds of different types of beans, and all of those beans are indigenous. So the only ones like common ones you'll see in the store that are not indigenous are like lentils and garbanzo beans and soybeans. Those are all Eurasian or Asiatic ingredients. But all the beans from pintos to black beans to flageolet to cannellini, those are all native foods.
Thank you. And then there are a few questions specifically about the squash. Can dried squash be used in this dish?
Oh yeah, it was you totally could if you have a dehydrator and you work with farmers or whatever, or you could even sun dry it. Butternut squash dries really well too, and it's nice and sweet. You could slice it really thin and dry it in a cookie sheet on a cookie sheet at home. Just put it in your oven at the lowest temperature possible and just let it dry out. Or you could string them up in chips and put them in the sun. But you could definitely add that crunch to the top of that, and it would be really pleasant.
Thank you. Two more questions about squash. Anne asks about the size. Butternut squash comes in different sizes. Is there a particular size that you prefer to work with, or that might have a better flavor or texture?
Yeah, certainly. This is about the size I like to use. Not too big, because as you know, butternut squash can get like that, right? And depending on if it's organic or not, or local, this is about the approximate size I like to use. Not too huge, but then I also like to, because you get more flavor and it's a little softer. And then also too, when the older they get and the bigger they get, this cavity this part right here will start to get hollow. It'll kind of get hollow. Just so that's my own preference. And there's another type of squash that's very similar to this called Buttercup Squash and Honey Nut Squash. They're both very sweet, and they're also very small and cute. So check them out sometime.
Great. And Ellen asks, what is your favorite way to use the seeds of the winter squash?
I'll just let them dry. If I got my squash from a farmer that I know, or I got my squash from someone that gave it to me as a gift, or gave it to me, say it was grown locally, or it's a really nice quality squash, I'll dry those seeds, and I'll either give them back to the farmer, or I'll keep them for myself, or I'll eat them. I'll toast them and eat them. So either way, if say I get a really nice, good Apache giant squash, or a really delicious, well-shaped kobacha squash, I like to save those seeds and either give them back to the grower or keep them for myself or eat them. Great.
And Christy has a question about the beans. Are they seasoned when you cook them before they're added to the dish?
You can, as they're cooking, you can put in, depending on how many beans you're doing, you can add in like a slice of onion just to give it a little aromatic base. You could toss in a small sprig of thyme, rosemary, or even juniper or cedar if you wanted. It's really up to you. I like to keep them just cook them in water, and then I add the seasoning towards the end. Again, just because I want just to taste the beans. That's it. I don't want to add too many other flavors yet. So
great. Anna asks, was the corn cooked or raw?
For this dish, it was raw, just because it would cook so fast in the pan. But if you're going to do this dish for many more people, you could roast the corn in the husk, or you could cook it ahead of time and cut it off the cob, and all you're doing is warming it up. You could even roast and cook all of these ingredients and separately, and then just heat them up, really. But for the purpose of the demonstration and talking about caramelization, I roasted them in the pan from a raw state.
Mhm. And Chris asks, can you use green beans in this dish?
Oh yeah, green beans are so good in this dish, especially coming up in spring when you get the little tiny baby ones. They're in kitchens, they call them haricots verts, but they're baby green beans. And if you use the full size beans, I recommend cutting them in like little 1/2 inch or inch pieces. And you can, if you know what blanching and shocking is, you can par cook them ahead of time, but they add a really nice color dimension, nice snap and crunch and sweetness. So yeah, definitely.
Great. And another person asked, what type of product are you using for your heat source?
Oh, I've got a little camp stove here. See that? It has a little butane insert. These are really handy, and you just load it up and turn it on. And it has a little safety switch. You can turn it on and off. But these are just, this one says it's a gas one, but you can get these in hardware stores, large stores, anywhere from 18 to like 25 bucks. If you pay more than 20 to $30, you pay too much.
Great. And
Yeah.
do you wash the pan and knife by hand or in the dishwasher?
I only wash my knives by hand, and this is a really important tip. Never, ever, ever, ever put your knives in the dish sink, even at home. You care for your knives because you don't want to put this in the dishwater and then forget about it, or someone you care about, or an employee, or your child reaches into the sink and they cut themselves. It can really, really hurt people. So I always hand wash the knives. The quality equipment, I always will hand wash it too. So.
Okay, great. And Michelle asks, why do you use dry beans rather than canned? Is there a flavor or nutritional difference?
Yeah, the canned beans, most canned beans will have a lot of sodium and preservatives and all other things in there. If you have to use canned beans, just try to get a low sodium organic product if you can. And you know, so it's just kind of a cooking fundamental, or letting the beans be what they are, and you have more control over it. It's just more nutritious too.
And someone else asked that they mentioned that they bought an automatic cooking pot. Do you recommend cooking indigenous foods in an automatic cooking pot?
Yeah, you probably already have been cooking indigenous foods in your cooking pot, right? Depends on what you're doing. What I like to say about food and cooking is that it's just like the board reads. It's a life skill, and it's relationship building. If we're in close quarters more because of the pandemic, and we're eating out less, as you know, the restaurant industry has been really hit hard globally. Like right now, there's tons of articles about New York being shut down and indoor dining stopping, and so many restaurants are hurting, and many more of us are cooking. It's relationship building. It's a way to begin to get to know yourself and new foods. And if you start to look at cooking like that at home, as opposed to getting fast foods or ordering out so much, you can pick up skills that are new, and you're learning a new skill that is a relationship, not just with yourself, but with the ingredients also. So like, you'll get to know how this behaves, right? You'll get to know how these ingredients behave or respond to heat. So that's what I mean by relationship building.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
There are so many questions, Nephi. We aren't going to be able to get to all of them, but
Sure.
I'd like to turn now to some questions that are more focused on other aspects of indigenous cuisine and your philosophy and thoughts about it. And I
Sure.
think what we're going to do is maybe we'll send you some of these questions that you could answer after the webinar. You could type up your answers if you're willing to, and we could send them out to everyone, so that some of these questions that aren't too difficult to answer, you could have the opportunity to later on. So there are a couple of questions about being a culinary professional. Kayanne, who is at Montana State University, asked, how can we join you in the Native American Culinary Association? And another person asked, what is your recommendation for Native youth interested in a culinary career? Where and how could they start?
Naka we started Naka kind of in the spirit of ceremony, how when it's driven by people that believe in it. So in the year 2000, 2003, then 2011, and then 2012 and 13, we had large gatherings that were public. And we haven't done any since, but I'm hoping to do something again relatively soon. So when it does happen, you can just, follow my social medias or even just get in touch somehow, because I'm sure you'll see something begin to come about. And the whole purpose of starting Naka was to support, like you mentioned, the young people that want to get into cooking, to not only just develop professional cooking as a cuisine in a professional setting, but also all of the whole web of knowledge and skills that come with food. So for young people that are looking to get into the culinary arts, I say, before you get into a cooking school, if you're going to go that route, try to find the best restaurant or the best restaurant in your area, and try to get asked to work for free. It's called a stage, and you can go in and just observe and watch for free, or you can actually get a job and see if it's right for you. Because the food industry is very professional cooking. It's very, very rigorous, and you need to start young, because in the early years, it's all about training and seeing different techniques and different approaches. And then as you get older, you start to mature and you get rooted. So you really need to put in your hours and get to work hard. So that's what I would recommend.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Mary asks, what resources or learnings do you think are key to share with students, particularly at the university level, but maybe even younger than that, around the ideas of food sovereignty, sustainable food systems, indigenous food systems, et cetera? And what can we bring into the classroom? What resources can we bring into the classroom?
I definitely think for the high school and academic levels, and even professional level, is that indigenous food sovereignty is a real thing. Everywhere you are in the United States, you're standing on Indian land. And for the farmers and cooks in those environments, they have a direct relationship with the environment. And also Native community members. And if you're near a reservation or on a reservation, for the most part, we're still interacting with the landscape to a certain extent, that we can recognize that the need for food access and the shifting climate as well. So there's this collective sense of urgency around sovereignty that it has to get into schools. There's a couple, if it's okay, a couple good reads that I like. Here's one good read that I know it's already getting into curriculum out there, but Indigenous Foods History, Indigenous Peoples History of the United States. This is a good one. And as you travel through this book, connect all of these momentous occasions from our perspective to food, because every single occurrence that's articulated in this particular book has a connection to foodways. It might not be specifically written in there, but the landscape and the violence and the trauma and the resurgence, they all have a food component. Then another one that can, this one is more recent, Indigenous Food Sovereignty in the United States. It talks about different practitioners across North America, and this is a really good one also, pretty recent, and I got a chapter in here too, so it's pretty cool. And there's many, many more books and publications out there. But what I can say for scholars and professionals is, in supporting Native food sovereignty, do your best to have a good sense of ethics. Try not to participate in the Columbusing, right? That we're discovering concepts or discovering us in a way, but allow the practitioners to build their platform and use their voice and articulate their experience, because that is the most important part. The Indigenous food sovereignty concept or movement, or whatever you might want to call it, it needs Native practitioners. And there are thousands of them. I'm just one of thousands that are out there. And more importantly than a chef's perspective is the community members' perspective. The people that are fluent language speakers, the people that know oral stories, the people that hunt, fish, and gather and farm, they have much, a whole other wide, vast knowledge as well. I'm just fortunate to be a chef that's kind of at the axis of all those concepts. So yeah, that's how you can kind of support.
Great. Kat is a farmer and gardener and asks, are there specific varieties of foods that you would like to see grown more often and more available for chefs, cooks, and eaters?
I think indigenous cultivars and heirloom varietals are really important because these are acorns, but you could look at these ingredients as carriers of knowledge. Here's what I mean when I'm talking about indigenous cultivars. This is a kernel of Apache corn that was grown in White River at Indebikiat by Apache farmers from Apache seeds that have been in families for generations. And so you could look at these as carriers of data, or this is like an indigenous microchip or a SIM card, right? And what device does it fit the best in? Indigenous people. So, and where does the data come from? It comes from the sun. It comes from photosynthesis and soil and climate and the science of growing. So there is so much data packed into this one kernel of corn, so much that it produces ceremonies and lifeways and songs. And so the cultivars are really important to be brought back and to be accessible, not only just to chefs and professional cooks, but to homes and communities as well. Because chefs, we're just kind of a cultural phenomenon. The chef culture is changing, and we don't know what it's going to look like on the other side of a pandemic. So I'd say the priority is homes, families, and communities for those indigenous cultivars to be grown.
Great. And do you have any suggestions, Nephi, for places that folks can get recipes? Some of the recipes that you use or that you might recommend for home cooks to cook some of these traditional foods?
Yeah, there's in the past 15 years, I've seen native foods explode like in a way. Number one, because I'm a native food practitioner, and everyone in my data sphere or my sine wave on social media, it seems like the whole world is doing native foods. But there's been a large number of books and information that have come out. I think I have, you can just look up Native American cookbooks. You can look up Indigenous Foodways. There's many more tutorials on indigenous food or Native American cooking on Vimeo or YouTube. You can follow like some of my work, or even you can follow hashtags too. Hashtags like Indigenous Foodways, Indigenous Food Sovereignty. You can follow that Gather site. There's tons of other practitioners on there. But essentially, maybe for this particular dish, what I like to say when you're going to do a Three Sisters dish at home is you just do equal parts corn, equal parts beans, equal parts squash. And that'll give you a nice mixture of the three cultivars. And you can just cook and season to your liking from there. So that's kind of an entry level tip on the Three Sisters.
Okay, great. Thank you. So we have one more, probably time for one more question, which is how can we elevate home cooking on the reservation where quality, nutritious food, produce especially, might be scarce?
So much of food access, again, going back to that presentation I did on the paradigm and the psychological, intellectual, and spiritual component of foodways and food practices, a lot of that comes back to power dynamics and how resources are distributed to Native communities. And not just Native communities, I'm talking marginalized communities in general, communities that are in poverty across America. The result of the impact of power dynamics in that are important. So when it comes to food access to healthcare, and supporting indigenous food sovereignty, if you're going to become an ally, an accomplice, or a practitioner, or someone deeply involved in this, be conscious of power dynamics and how resources are shifted. Because when it comes down to getting the foodways and the knowledge into curriculum, into food meal plans, into cafeterias for schools and healthcare centers, when it comes down to natives being able to utilize traditional ecological knowledge to monetize that in their communities for their benefit, a lot of this comes down to policy and shifting power dynamics. And there's a lot of bias, racism, and colonial violence in the nature of power dynamics. So that's why food is so political, so cultural, and there's such a sense of urgency for ethical practitioners to be advocates at that level, because I can't do some of this food work if I don't have the means to articulate the experience, and maybe even in the legal system to articulate the terms of how colonial violence is real, and how from a legal standpoint, having access to some of these foods is a legal right, and using that leverage to reclaim some of this knowledge and information. So I feel like it's more important than ever not to just focus on the romantic side of Indigenous cooking. We can just doing an acknowledgement is not enough. Just hashtagging and sharing a site on social media isn't enough. It comes down to ethical solution-based action and intelligent coexistence if we're going to really let this indigenous food sovereignty set roots for the next couple generations. So that's the best way I can answer that question. I hope it does.
Yes, thank you. So I'm going to give you the last word, Nephi, but before I do, I would like to remind everyone that we have a wonderful webinar planned for Thursday on food as medicine. Nephi is going to be one of the panelists, along with an all-star group of fantastic people. It's the same time as this webinar on Thursday. The link to the RSVP has been posted in the chat. Also, we would love if you would fill out a poll at the end of this, and the link to the poll has also been posted in the chat. That would just give us a little feedback on this webinar. How did you like it? Do you have ideas for future webinars, etc.? Because we'll follow up on your ideas. And so I want to thank you so much, Nephi. This was an absolutely extraordinary session. As I said, the folks in the chat have been sending you all kinds of thanks and respect and love. And I thank you. The Native American Nutrition Conference thanks you. And I'd like to turn it back to you now to see if you have any parting words.
Okay. Thank you very much for taking the time out of your busy life to come and be with us during this webinar. I really appreciate your receptiveness and participation. I hope you enjoyed seeing some of the techniques demonstrated. Thank you for those of you that have maybe watched the film Gather, for supporting that film, because in that film, we're just a small handful of practitioners. There could be a Gather film on every single tribal group in North America and South America, because the phenomenon of colonialism that we're up against in order to reclaim our health is very, very real. So thank you for that support. I encourage you to continue to cook at home, switch up the paradigm around food and cooking, and look at it as an act of self-care. Remember, self-care is not our jobs. It's not what we do on a regular basis. So even though I'm a professional chef, self-care is making time to cook or doing something new and different. So if you're going to practice self-care, consider your food choices. Maybe one of them is switching to drinking a lot of water instead of any other beverage you might choose. That could be an act of self-care. Choosing healthier snacks throughout the day is a form of self-care. So there are so many group dynamics and elements to cooking and food history that when you choose to see it differently, it can really be empowering on a very small, intimate level and a very big level as well. Thank you for allowing me to share and to speak. I hope I've helped you to see food a little bit differently. And this is something I love, and it's something I'll continue to do. You can follow, I do my work on Instagram and social media. I do a lot of these webinars as well. And so I want to encourage you to be safe and be creative, and look for the action-oriented and solution-based pathways to move forward so that we can continue to promote and develop Native American foodways and food sovereignty. So thank you, everybody. I appreciate your time, and wash your hands, wear your masks, and stay safe.
Thank you so much, Nephi.
Mhm.
Bye-bye, everyone.